Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Just like your favorite neighborhood bookshop, this show is a place to explore, find hidden gems, and meet new writers from every corner of the publishing world. Feel free to browse around and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm your host, Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and your guide to great conversations with some amazing writers. This is episode number 274. If you enjoy the show, please take a moment to leave a review, follow along on social media, and share the podcast with fellow readers. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank the independent bookstores that do so much to support local authors and strengthen their literary communities. Independent bookstores are wonderful places to discover writers from your own hometown or from the places you're visiting while traveling. So this summer, whether you're setting off on vacation or staying close to home, make a point of stopping by an indie bookstore and discovering the stories being written there. And if your travels bring you to St. Augustine, Florida, the setting of my Old City Mystery series, be sure to visit Book in Hand on Anastasia Boulevard, Midnight Moon Books and Boutique on King Street, and Second Read Books on Cordova Street. If you've read my books, those street names will probably sound very familiar. On today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm joined by author Derek Baxter to discuss his latest book, The Forgotten World War, exploring the secret history of the American Revolution from Spain to India and back again. Many of us think of the American Revolution as a colonial struggle, American colonies fighting for their independence from Britain. While that's certainly how the conflict began, it didn't stay that way for long. As Derek reveals in his book, the Revolutionary War quickly expanded into a global conflict, with battles being fought across multiple continents and oceans. Most people know about France's role in the war, but what about the Dutch Republic, the Oneida Nation, or the Kingdom of Mysore in India? And while the Siege of Yorktown is often seen as the war's decisive conclusion, major fighting continued elsewhere around the world long after the guns fell silent in Virginia. In The Forgotten War, Derek paints a much broader picture of the Revolution, revealing a conflict that was far more international and far more complex than many of us learned in school. In this episode, I'll chat with Derek about his writing journey, the extensive travel and research that went into the book, and why many of Britain's enemies joined the fight for reasons that had little to do with liberty and everything to do with their own strategic interests, as well as a few other things. Coming up next. Derek Baxter, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I want to welcome you again for your second visit to the podcast. And this time we are going to talk about your brand new book, The Forgotten World War, exploring the secret history of the American Revolution from Spain to India and back again. So that's quite a title, and there's a lot to cover, but can you summarize what the book is about? And then let's talk about what inspired you to write it.
Sure. The book is about how the Revolutionary War was actually a world war. And the fighting in America was a very important part, but it was just one theater of this world war. And there was fighting in the Caribbean and in Europe and in India. And this was a story that I really hadn't learned in school and just really surprised me, and one that I wanted to learn more about and understand how all of these other countries, France, Spain, the Dutch, and others were involved in this coalition against Britain. So for me, the way I love to, learn about things, find out about things, is often to have firsthand experiences and go there in person. So I traveled to a lot of the sites of this world war, the battlefields and places where diplomacy happened, and tried to talk to people to find out more about this kind of, I think, missing part of the story of the revolution.
Let's start with the basics, because as you mentioned, there's more to this than we're normally taught in school. So people probably have at least a base knowledge of the Revolutionary War. And even within that, I'm sure there are some things that we generally get wrong, right? Some gaps in the basics of what we were taught or what we remember. That is different from what you're talking about here, this sort of secret history. But let's start sort of at the beginning. I'm curious, based on your all of your experience and all of your research, is there anything big that we tend to get wrong about the Revolutionary War, based on sort of the basic learning that we all
Sure.
have?
I think what we often don't understand is that it was a global conflict, and it started as a struggle, colonial struggle here in the 13 colonies and the American grievances, but it expanded very quickly, and that's because we, the Americans, were taking on the superpower in the form of the British, and we were just not equipped to do so. We didn't have the gunpowder, we didn't have cannons, we didn't have military engineers, and most of all, we didn't have a navy to take on the British Navy. And so we were dependent on getting other countries into the war, France and Spain most prominently, but others fought as well. And to turn it into something much larger, so Britain was pinned down in different areas of the war. So I think that's one of the kind of missing links that we don't see. So we're focused on the fighting here, which obviously was a very key part of it, but that so much more happened, and often on a much greater scale. These armies and navies clashing in other parts of the world, the battles were often much larger than the battles here in America. So they deserve to be part of the story and remembered as well.
And let's dive
Mhm.
into that because I was thinking of questions to ask, and I finally just started writing down very basic questions: who, and how, and why. So, because there just seems so much information. Can we talk about the players? We might know a few of the big ones, but there are others involved, as you're alluding to. So, can we talk about who was involved, who became our allies in
Sure,
this?
sure. And the use of allies is an interesting question because some of these nations were formally allied with the U.S., some weren't, and were more informally partners with us. But in any case, they were all fighting Britain, and we all know about the French. I'm sure everybody remembers Lafayette and from Hamilton and maybe Rochambeau. But the French aid went way beyond those two officers. And the French were giving Washington arms even from the very early days of the war. So the French formally entered the war in 1778, and the Spanish did so in 1779. So that's about midway through the war. But both of those nations had been heavily arming the U.S. behind the scenes throughout from the very early days. And I think we don't appreciate Spain's role in the war very much. And maybe that's because Spain did not want to officially be an ally of the US for most of the war because they were worried that their own colonies might catch wind of the spirit of independence, and would also rebel because they had so many colonies in Latin America. But Spain was formed a big part of it, and they were interested in, they had their own reasons for entering. This wasn't for a love of liberty, that they came into the war, but they very much wanted to reconquer territory that the British had taken from them earlier. The Spanish did. The French had their own reasons too. They were less interested in getting land back that they had lost to Britain in other wars. They were more interested in just restoring the balance of power. Because before the Revolutionary War, the 7 Years' War, which we often call the French and Indian War here, was just a catastrophic loss for France and Spain. And they wanted to kind of turn the tables. France felt like their influence in Europe was at a real low point, and they want to reverse that. So they had their own reasons for coming in, but once the French and Spanish came into the war, it completely changed the equation. One example I could give you quickly is we think of Washington and his men suffering at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 78. It was desperate. Men were starving. And the British are sitting right there, very close to Valley Forge in Philadelphia, well fed, enjoying the capital. And everybody expected this in the spring, the British would just march out and wipe out the rest of Washington's forces. Instead, they evacuated. The British did. And it was because the French had entered the war. And now the redcoats, a bunch of them, 5,000 of them had to be shipped down to Jamaica to protect British islands. They didn't want to lose Jamaica. Philadelphia was fine, but they were much more interested in Jamaica, which produced all this sugar and was immensely profitable. So it just changed the whole war aims of all the countries involved and kind of changed the geopolitical dynamics of what would happen in the rest of the war.
And so those were sort of earlier
Yeah.
entrants, but there are other lesser known
Yes.
entities.
Yes. Yes. So the French and the Spanish were the most involved in terms of soldiers, ships, resources. But there were three other nations that I highlight in the book. And one is the Oneida Indians, located in upstate New York, Iroquois nation, a Haudenosaunee nation. And many of the other Iroquois nations chose to ally with the British, but the Oneida actually threw their lot in with the Americans, the Patriot side, and helped in the Saratoga campaign and served as scouts and warriors and were present at many battles during the Revolutionary War. So I thought that was an important group to highlight. The Dutch got involved. So it's interesting that I think that the very first salute of the American flag by a foreign power actually happened in the Caribbean by the Dutch. So there's this island, St. Eustatius, which is still actually part of the Netherlands formally today, and is a tiny, small little island in the Leeward Islands. And that's where in the early years of the war, a lot of the arms were being smuggled to. They were being sent to St. Eustatius, and traders, merchant ships would come from the 13 colonies and get the smuggled guns and gunpowder and run them back up and avoid the British blockade to get them to the Patriot soldiers. And we sent in the fall of 1776, we sent a ship with a copy of the Declaration of Independence because we're trying to make that known to the world. And also we wanted guns. And so we sailed into, the Americans sailed into St. Eustatius, and they fired off a cannon salute the first time we had been recognized. And the Dutch would not become officially into the war until very late, but eventually they would be, because all the smuggling was kind of behind the scenes, obviously, but they later entered the war. And then the final nation that I highlight in the book is the Mysore Kingdom of India. And this definitely wasn't on anyone's radar when they're reading about the Revolutionary War. At least it wasn't on mine, for sure. And this is in the south of India. It's a kingdom that was allied with France. And when France joined the war and British and French started fighting on the subcontinent, the Mysore Kingdom entered the fray too. And they actually inflicted the largest defeat on the British during the war per capita of the entire war, was right there in the south of India. And it's just this amazing story of this fearsome army. They had a 90,000 person army, which is just boggles the mind, because the best Washington could do was generally around 20,000 soldiers as kind of at its peak. So this massive army, they had it had a cavalry of horses and elephants, and they actually had rockets. They had this military rocket technology that the British would later copy. So one anecdote which I love is that the phrase "the rocket's red glare" in the Star Spangled Banner from the War of 1812, that actually came directly from the technology that the British saw used against them in the Revolutionary War by the Mysore Kingdom, as they copied it. And that's what Francis Scott Key saw a couple of decades later and wrote about.
Well, and I know that people consider Yorktown sort of the end, or that's sort of the back part, the last
Yeah.
big thing that happens in the war. We sort of stop there. But I think anybody who studies military history knows that there's a lot more that happens after that. So I'm curious, the way Yorktown came about and the victory that happened there. Are we right in thinking, well, that was really the last big thing? That was really the last important thing to happen? I'm guessing it probably wasn't.
You're right. It wasn't. The war continued on. The British Yorktown was a tremendous Allied success. Cornwallis lost his entire army, but the British still had plenty of soldiers all around the world, and they kept fighting. And actually, some of the very biggest battles of the war happened after Yorktown. So things got quieter for the most part in America, but there were huge battles in the Caribbean and in Europe and in India. And the sense was after Yorktown that um, that America probably was going to get its independence, or at least a good part of it. It wasn't guaranteed that all 13 colonies would become independent, though, because the British still occupied South Carolina and New York and some other places. And there was also some thinking that they could negotiate a peace where they hang on to what they had. So the war continued, and yes, our history books often jump from Yorktown to then the Treaty of Paris, but there was a lot of action going around the rest of the world in the rest of the world at the time. Another thing that fascinated me about Yorktown and the victory there was it was all predicated on the this naval battle that happened just before um the month before the siege, and in which the French defeated the British off the coast of Virginia. And I think this is fascinating that there's so much more to the story than just that the Spanish were quite involved. The reason that the French got to Yorktown with this huge fleet of 28 ships of the line, which were the big warships of the day, was because the Spanish agreed to watch over the Caribbean in their absence and convinced them to, yes, sail north with as many ships, with every ship that they could bring. And the Spanish even paid for the French to go up there. The French were out of money in the Caribbean, and Rochambeau and his men in the U.S. were very low on money, and so was Washington, for that matter. And it was the Spanish who raised money from Cuba. They got money from all the wealthy merchants of Cuba, gave it to the French, and the French sailed north because of the Spanish help in the Caribbean and because they gave them the funds for Yorktown. So the fact that Spain helped make our victory at Yorktown possible, I had no idea about that. So I think it's just fascinating to see just how more complex and rich the story is when you get into it.
Right, right. It's mind-boggling, and it's shocking to think that the story has been pared down to a few people and a few
Yeah.
battles and eliminated all of this other history, which makes it so much richer and more important. You would think the opposite would have happened. You think to claim it as such a huge victory, we would have included all of that and made sure everybody understood what a big thing it was. It's interesting that it's gone the other way, that we've shrunk it. And
We shrunk it to just us, and the idea that, well, we won at Yorktown, so there we won our independence. When really it was, you're right, we're at the centerpiece. And granted, America was kind of at the center of the action in terms of we're the ones who started it, but it expanded so far beyond that. The analogy I think of sometimes is that a little like the Vietnam War, that's why Britain chose to stop fighting in the end. It's not that they couldn't have kept fighting, but they saw it. They were just getting they were just kind of grinding down and having more and more domestic opposition in their own country. So much money had gone into the war. And the British were just so worried about losing other colonies, losing Jamaica, which was so profitable, worried about India and losing. And at one point, it looked like the French and the Mysore Kingdom might actually knock them out of all of South India. So they were seeing reverses in other parts of the world that they decided at some point just let these kind of unruly colonists go in America is the best course of action. Not to say they couldn't have kept fighting, but it was just becoming just not tenable given everything going on. So it was kind of a long, drawn out war. And yeah, it's just a different viewing of the war when you look at it that way.
yeah, yeah. So, how did we get involved with all these various parts? Who was instrumental in bringing them on board? Because I'm curious how this grouping of independent countries and people with their own interests and objectives were kind of roped into what we consider to be this domestic colonial struggle. So who was responsible for bringing them all in?
I think the key player in all of this was the French. France was kind of at the centerpiece of this coalition. So, and Benjamin Franklin obviously had played a good role in Paris. He was our ambassador in Paris. He played a very positive role in terms of helping to get the French into the war. But France behind the scenes, especially the foreign affairs minister, the Comte de Vergennes. So he's very little known, not well known in most, I think, tellings of the Revolutionary War. But for me, he's right up there with Washington in terms of an indispensable person to keep this war going because Vergennes really wanted to inflict a defeat on the British. He was the one who persuaded the Spanish to enter the war. Um, the King of France and the King of Spain were related, and they had fought their kingdoms had fought together in other wars, and France helped persuade the Spanish to enter the war. They also, of course, had the kingdom that they were allied with in India, the Mysore kingdom. The Dutch had their own reasons for participating. Their merchants were the ones who were actively smuggling arms to America, and there was a lot of for the Dutch. It was somewhat ideological too, because there was a strong identification with the American struggle and the need for liberty. So they entered the war on the later side formally. But for the European nations, it was, I think, France that really served as kind of the catalyst to bring all these countries together.
Yeah. And you mentioned that they all had their individual interests. They
Mhm.
were in a lot of ways aligned, but they were not just doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They had their own agenda in entering this war. Did they get what they wanted at the end of the day?
That's an interesting question, and you're right. For the most part, they weren't doing it just because they loved the cause of America. They loved liberty. It's kind of ironic. These are all of those European countries are monarchies, and the Dutch had some more democratic elements, but for France and Spain in particular, supporting a group of rebels that wanted to overthrow a monarchy seems a little strange. But they definitely had their own reasons for doing so. And no, for the most part, they didn't get everything they wanted at the end for the amount, especially for the amount of sacrifices that they made. So France and Spain gave the equivalent of $30 billion US just in aid to the Americans. So this isn't even talking about the cost that they spent on their armies and navies, and the navy is in particular in those days was very, very expensive. So the French state was in deep, deep debt after all this, and that was one of the causes, not the only, but it contributed to their financial problems that led to the French Revolution later on in the 1780s. But France had been hoping their aim was to really take Britain down a peg, which did happen. But then also they thought they were going to open themselves up to have direct trade with America, and that they would really replace Britain in terms of being our main trading partner. And that didn't happen. Somewhat surprisingly, we just, well, maybe not surprisingly, but we just returned to trade with Britain when the war was done. Um, Spain did a little better because they did recover some of the territory that they had lost in the Seven Years' War. In particular, they got the island of Minorca back. They took Florida, the Florida region from Britain, but they didn't get everything they wanted. And their main war goal was to recover Gibraltar, the base on the Mediterranean. And they did everything they could to try to take Gibraltar during the war. They laid siege to it for several years. They had tens of thousands of soldiers surrounding Gibraltar. At one point, the the Allies actually sent these floating armed batteries to attack the Rock of Gibraltar. It's kind of looked like something that you'd see later in the Civil War, like these armed ships covered with iron and protected to try to withstand the firing almost directly down from them from Gibraltar. But it didn't work, and they never did get Gibraltar back. Today, of course, it remains British.
Right, right. Why do you think we, the US as a nation, have forgotten, and I use that sort of in quotes, why do you think we have forgotten this part of the history of the Revolutionary War?
It's it's difficult to say, but it is very underappreciated, and I think it's frankly that over the many centuries it's turned into a story just about the Americans, and we forgot just how connected and interdependent we were with all of these other nations. The interesting thing I found was that if you read a history of the American Revolution in the year, say, 1800, you would have known all about the global aspect of it. So actually, that's what sparked my book this whole project to begin with. I read a history written in 1805. It was actually written even earlier, but it was published in 1805 by Mercy Otis Warren, really the first female historian in the United States. And she had this unparalleled access to a lot of the players of the revolution. She knew Washington and Jefferson and Lafayette and others. And and she wrote all about, just very matter of factly, about some of the same battles that I'm talking about in Central America. And she wrote about India, all just as part of the Revolutionary War. And mind you, these are not battles just that happen to be taking place at the same time as the Revolutionary War. They're all tied together as part of the same war. But over time, certainly that was in 1805. Certainly by the time I was reading histories, in my school book, they weren't talking about any of this. And I think part of it has just been the story's been redirected towards America. The role of the French is, the French are still mentioned for sure, but I think it's probably still underappreciated just how critical the French were. Even at the Siege of Yorktown, there were the entire Navy that won the battle right before the siege was French, and there were more French soldiers there than Americans. So, not to you know, denigrate the role of the Americans, which was important, but the French were just incredibly critical to all this. So, it's that role has been reduced. The role of the Spanish, I think, they started to drop out of the story in the 1800s, particularly as the United States clashed with Spain over Mexico, and later in the Spanish-American War, and Spain became a real rival. And the fact that just kind of their key role in the Revolutionary War just started to drop out. And but it happened, and I think it's a shame, because I think we should remember everything just as it happened. Even at the time, this was interesting, say, of the Oneida Indians who fought alongside us. Lafayette made a return trip to the United States in 1824 to 1825. He was an old man. He was one of the last surviving officers from the war, and he made this grand tour. He went to every single state we had in the Union, and he went to upstate New York, and he had bonded with the Oneida. He had fought alongside the Oneida, and he went to this place. He remembered being at a campfire with the Oneida, and he went up to Oneida, New York, in that area, and said, "Wait a minute, where are the Oneida? They're not here." And so many of them had been displaced and lost their land. And the townspeople hosting him didn't even know about the story. They were kind of embarrassed. So just 50 or so years after it happened, that part of the story had already been obscured. So it's a shame. So we're hoping, I'm hoping, I was just so excited to learn about all this stuff, and I'm hoping that other people can learn some of it as well.
Right. As far as you know, did these other nations, these other players who were involved, did they forget as well? We have narrowed the focus and shrunk the story. Did they sort of erase their participation in it as well, or is it still very much a part of their history?
I was happy to see that it's remembered still in the places I went to. And there's definitely a lot of pride. So the Oneida I think, are rightfully proud of being America's first allies, and you can visit their cultural center in Oneida, New York. I went up there for the book, and they have, they have great displays on that. The Dutch in the Caribbean also remember the first salute. They recreate it every year. So I went down there to witness that, and that was just a really amazing experience. They have kind of a replica cannon firing off the shots, and they have a lot of speeches and music and dancing, and is kind of a carnival type atmosphere. So that was just a lot of fun to experience. I think Spain also is proud of their role and wants it to be recognized more. And so one of the things I did for the book too was travel there to where one of the real Spanish heroes of the revolution is from, this little town in Andalusia, in the mountains, from the village of Machara Villaya is what it's called. And his name was Bernardo de Galvez. Galveston, Texas is named after him. He was the governor of Louisiana, which was still Spanish. It wasn't French at that time. And he had all these successful attacks on the British, and he took Pensacola, Florida, which was just a key battle. And I could get into the whole strategy of why that's key, but nonetheless, he had all these successes for Spain. And every year, the little town where he's from has a 4th of July ceremony and pageant, which seems kind of crazy to think about. But we went there. I went there with my family. And so just so funny to be there on the 4th and it's just very American. And they've got the American flag, and they had reenactors recreate the Siege of Pensacola, and you can get American food like hot dogs and cotton candy, and it's just great. So I'm not saying like all of Spain remembers it that well, but I think there's certainly pockets here and there where people still remember their country's role in the war.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your research because this
Mhm.
was, as you mentioned, more than just kind of combing through some history books and putting it all together. So how far did you go? I mean, how much of a deep dive? What actual historical records did you have to uncover to put the timeline together and the pieces together and the players on the board? How far did you have to travel to find the details of this participation? I'm curious what it entailed and how long it took you.
Yeah, it was over a period, probably about 4 years or so of work. And yeah, some work um, in the archives, reading there are other good books on either the entire war or on pieces of it. But I think the thing that I did with that was probably unusual was actually to go to a lot of these sites, and I wanted to see them with my own eyes, but I also wanted to talk to people, local experts, wherever I could find them. Which also made my job easier because they had done all the research and work, and I could just learn from them. So I did that wherever I could, and I found people to talk to. I went to India and I spoke to people who knew about those battles back then, and the same. I went to a small island in the English Channel, the island of Jersey, where the French had landed and tried to take it from the British, and found somebody who could tell me all about that story. So yeah, that was kind of my approach wherever possible, was to go to these places. Went to the Caribbean, went to Mexico, which is where the Spanish assembled forces for big battles, and you can. One of the fun things too is just seeing all of these different forts, because sometimes they would look familiar. So I saw some fort in India. It's like, oh yeah, that reminds me somewhat of that fort I saw in Mexico. And the fact that they really were all part of the same war. And in some cases you had like British officers going from one theater to the other and being transferred all around, was just kind of cool to make those connections and to kind of link all those places together in my mind.
When you talk to the local experts, the people who
Mhm.
were had done the research there, were they surprised that we as a nation had sort of forgotten their involvement? I mean, did that come as a surprise to them?
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know if anybody quite put it like that, but I think of all these places, they're just the people seem very interested in wanting this full story to come out, and wanting the full story to be remembered. And went to a couple of other places actually, not so far away, but I mentioned Bernardo de Galvez, and so there was fighting in Louisiana, which was not part of America, of course, at the time. But I think that's interesting. I think the people I met there definitely wanted that story to be remembered, that they were part of the Revolutionary War too. Um, I also traveled up to Canada. I haven't mentioned this yet, but for very interesting reasons, the Americans decided to invade Canada very early, before we had even drafted the Declaration of Independence, hoping that Canadians in Quebec would rise up and join the colonies, and also seek independence. It didn't work out, although they did have several military victories. It was ultimately, the whole campaign failed. But I went up there, and it was also interesting to talk to experts there about that whole dynamic of the war. So it was global from a very early part, really throughout the entire war. There was this international dimension to it.
Yeah. What do you think it takes? I mean, your book is, a good start. What do you think it would take for people to change their perspective of the American Revolution from something that was just, oh, it's just a little conflict that happened here that kicked everything off, to this was an event that happened on the world stage. It took place globally. What do you think needs to shift for that understanding to change?
Yeah, I think certainly reading about it, and listening to podcasts like this, and then hopefully I encourage people in my book to go out there and see some of these sites, for yourself. And some of them aren't that hard to do. Like a few of the sites that I talk about are not really all that off the beaten path. For example, there's this place in France called Vaucieux in Normandy, which is where the French armies trained. They had these huge tens of thousands of troops doing training exercises before they shipped off to the US and other places. And this is actually quite close to the D-Day beaches. It's probably a 15-minute drive or so, where obviously lots of American tourists go through that area. So that would be an interesting stopover. And the same with some of the places in the Caribbean and elsewhere. You can, or even if you go to Versailles, there's so much to see about the French monarchy there, but that's also the place where Benjamin Franklin met with the French minister, the Comte de Vergennes, and they planned out really, the campaigns and the alliance that would lead to our independence. So I hope people can kind of weave in the story of the Revolutionary War as a world war, maybe even in their own travels.
Do you think it would change people's perspectives about global relations, let's say, to realize that since America's early days, we have been involved in global politics from the very beginning? We didn't go it alone. There were a lot of people out there in a lot of different places that were participating in something that affected us. Do you think if we viewed the American Revolution as sort of the first World War, let's say, do you think that would change people's view of where America sits and how we're allied with people? I don't want to get into politics per se. I'm just curious if you think it would change our perspective of things.
Yeah, it might. It certainly changed my perspective. Um, it was the fact that it was a world war, and there had been probably the 7 Years' War would fall into that
Mm.
category too. But in that case, we were just fighting as colonists alongside Britain, and here, um, we, the new nation, allied and partnered with all these other nations. The thing that really surprised me quite a bit was to learn about the Declaration of Independence, which obviously we all know it and I love it. And I wrote my first book about Jefferson. So I'm, so interested in the Declaration, but I just did not appreciate until now that it was for a foreign audience almost as much as for the domestic audience, that it was in effect a cry for help. And that was one of the real reasons we went to all the trouble of drafting this formal document, which countries didn't always do when they were rebelling. But we really wanted this legally viable document to say, look, we are a real nation, because France and Spain wouldn't partner with like an unofficial group of rebels that, they really, they, for protocol purposes and diplomatic purposes, they needed to be dealing with another nation. And if you look at, Richard Henry Lee, he was the delegate from Virginia who put forth the resolution for independence. And in his correspondence before doing this, he was talking to other friends who were just saying, yes, we need this to become independent. This is the key to getting the European powers involved in our side. So it does say that towards the end of the declaration, that this new United States can contract with foreign powers. And immediately once it was printed, the declaration was put off on a ship and sent towards France. I mean, there was no delay. They wanted the world to know, as well as Americans. They also wanted the rest of the world to know that we are a new state. We're open for business, and we very much need your help. At the same time they were drafting the Declaration of Independence, John Adams was working on a draft of a model treaty with other foreign powers. And eventually Franklin would get that draft and share it with France, and it would be shared with other countries. So from the beginning, we very much saw our very founding was part of this kind of international network, and one that we knew we needed to be part of from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. Well, where do you go from here? This has taken up a large part of your life for the last several years. So I'm curious, do you have a new project on the horizon? Is there something you are currently working on, or will you just kind of wait to see what strikes your interest next?
Yeah, no, nothing I'm actually working on now. I think the main thing in this year of 2026, there's just so much of what we just talked about. And you can go deeper in rabbit holes on just about every single topic we've been able to touch on. There's just so much to share. So right now I'm just trying to focus on getting that word out about the story of our independence and the story of the war. And yeah, just trying to share that with people right now.
Good. Well, I wish you luck with it. It's no small task.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. It really has been a labor of love, though. It's been so much fun to go to these places and other countries and make connections and see how, kind of for my own purposes, see how the war really fit together and understand now, oh, at the same time that, Valley Forge was happening here, this was happening in France. And at the same time, Saratoga, this other battle was going on somewhere else. So to kind of be able to put the pieces together is a lot of fun.
Well, if people want to learn more about you and what you have going on and more about the book, that sort of thing, where should they go to find you and that information?
They can go to my website, Derek Baxter Books, and I'm on social media, and I've been putting out, interesting stories that, from my travels on social media lately, which has kind of been fun to share those, especially as we're marking it's the 250th anniversary of this or that. So yeah, I've got some stuff out there that people can check out.
Good. And if they want to purchase a copy of the book, where should they go to buy it?
Yeah, I've got links on my website. So it's in independent bookstores, it's in Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Yeah, it's available wherever people get their books. There's an audiobook as well.
Good. And in this anniversary year, what better way to celebrate than to learn a little bit more about the subject? So hopefully people will pick up a copy.
Well, that would be great. Yes. Yeah, it is such a time that I think a lot of us are thinking back on this history and reflecting on where we started and what it means to be an American. I think this is the interesting part of the story that I do hope comes out.
Right. Well, Derek, I want to thank you very much for joining me again today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with, let me get this title right, The Forgotten World War, Exploring the Secret History of the American Revolution from Spain to India and back again. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is all about helping readers discover new voices. This show brings you into conversation with authors from every corner of the writing world, and each of them has a story worth hearing. I'm your host, Stacey Horan, author of the Old City Mystery series and several standalone novels. Sharing conversations with fellow writers is one of my favorite parts of the creative life, and I'm thrilled to bring those conversations to you. Keep listening, keep exploring, and keep finding the stories that speak to you. There's always another treasure waiting here in the bookshop at the end of the internet.